Lenora Pike didn't bother lowering her voice. That was the thing about women like her. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, performed for an audience, designed to land where it would bruise deepest. She stood 3 stalls down from Mara Bellamy's table at the Sunday market, parasol tilted just so, her voice carrying clean across the morning air like she wanted the whole town to hear. I'll say this for Mara. She's got nerve thinking a man like Gideon Rourke comes to that table for anything but pie. A pause, timed perfectly. Lord knows there's plenty of it. The laughter that followed was small. 2 women, not a crowd. But it didn't need to be a crowd. Mara heard every syllable. She kept her hands moving, kept wrapping the pie tin in cloth, kept her face pointed down at her table. Her jaw was tight, her eyes were dry. She had learned, a long time ago, that the worst thing you could do in front of Lenora Pike was let her see she'd drawn blood. But the damage was done. And somewhere across the market square, without knowing what had just been said, Gideon Rourke set down his coffee and turned his hat in his hands and looked in the direction of Mara's table, the way a man looks at something he is still figuring out how to say out loud. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something in you, something about waiting too long, about finally being seen, about building your life back from the ground up, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. These stories travel farther than I ever expected, and I want to see how far this one goes. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Mara Bellamy had been a widow for 4 years by the time any of this started, and in those 4 years she had learned 3 things with absolute certainty. A homestead doesn't care whether you're grieving, fences don't fix themselves on sentiment alone. And the Sunday market was the only place in Garrison, Montana, where the work of her hands could be converted into something she could spend. She set up her table the same way every week, cloth down first, then the sign. Hand-lettered on a plank of pine she'd sanded herself, Bellamy Pies. The letters not perfectly even but readable, which was enough. Then the pies. In the order they came out of the crate. Apple first, then the cherry, if she had enough fruit, then whatever she'd managed to put together from whatever the week had offered. She priced them fair because she wasn't interested in gouging anyone, and because she understood down in her bones what it felt like to count out coins before reaching for something. The market ran from 7 in the morning until early afternoon. Mara was always one of the first to arrive and always one of the last to leave. Not because she had nowhere to be, because she needed to sell everything she'd brought, and because leaving early meant leaving money on the table, and she didn't have the luxury of that kind of pride. Her homestead sat 5 miles east of town on land that had been her husband Thomas's before it became hers by default. She kept it running. Barely, some months, but she kept it running. The vegetable garden paid for flour and sugar. The chickens paid for lamp oil. The pigs, when she had to sell one, covered the larger costs she couldn't outrun. The pies were the difference between managing and drowning. She understood exactly where she stood in the arithmetic of her own survival. The townspeople of Garrison knew Mara. The way they knew a reliable tool. They respected what she could do. They'd come to count on her in a rough season, and they didn't think much about what she went home to at night. She was strong. She was capable. She had wide shoulders and wide hips, and a face that people called handsome when they were being generous and plain when they weren't thinking. She didn't spend much time worrying about what they called her. She had fences to mend and pigs to feed and pies to bake before the sun came up on Sunday. She was 28 years old, and the thought of being loved again had started to feel like a thought that belonged to someone else's life. The first time Gideon Rourke stopped at her table, she almost didn't notice him. She was making change for an older man who always bought 2 slices of cherry and liked to tell her about his daughter in Billings, and she had one hand on the cloth and the other counting out coins when a shadow crossed the table and a voice said quietly and without preamble, "How much for a slice of the apple?" She looked up. He was a big man, not heavy, but broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who worked outdoors in all weather, year after year, without stop. His hat was old but clean. He hadn't shaved in a few days, but the rest of him was put together with a kind of rough care that said he knew how to take care of things even when he wasn't in the mood to bother. His eyes were dark and he was looking at the pies, not at her. 20 cents, she said. He nodded, reached into his coat, put a quarter on the table. I don't have change for a quarter right now, she said. I can get it from the next sale. Keep it, he said. He picked up his slice. She'd wrapped it in wax paper before he even asked, and he walked away. He didn't look back. He didn't offer his name or ask hers. He ate the pie standing near the livery post at the edge of the square, and then he left. And Mara went back to her work and didn't think about it again until the following Sunday, when the same shadow crossed the same table and the same voice said, "1 slice of apple." She looked up again. He was already watching the pies. 20 cents, she said. He put a quarter on the table without being asked. She cut his slice, wrapped it in paper, handed it over. He nodded, just barely, the kind of nod that wasn't exactly a thank you, but was the closest some men got, and walked back to the livery post. The third Sunday, she had the slice cut and wrapped before he finished crossing the square. He stopped when he saw it sitting there on the cloth, already waiting. Something moved in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the shadow of one. He put his quarter down. He picked up the slice, and when he turned to walk away, he said, almost too quietly to catch, "Good crust." Mara looked at the quarter in her hand. "Thank you," she said, to a man who was already walking away. That was November. By December, she had started calling him, only in her own head, the Sunday man. She didn't ask around about him. She didn't want to know more than what she could observe directly. He came, he paid, he left. That was a transaction. Transaction she understood. She found out who he was by accident, in the middle of a conversation she wasn't trying to have. Dottie Crane, who sold preserves 3 tables down, and who had an opinion about everything and the voice to back it up, sidled over one Sunday afternoon after the market had thinned and said, without introduction, "You know who that is, don't you? Coming to your table every week." Mara was counting her take. "I know he likes apple pie." "That's Gideon Rourke." Dottie said it the way you say a name you expect to land. When it didn't, she pressed on. "He owns the Rourke spread north of the Callaway line. 3,000 acres, maybe more. Lost his wife, Eleanor, 6 years back. Fever took her fast. Since then, he barely comes to town, barely speaks to anyone, manages his ranch with 2 hands and keeps to himself." Mara put her coins away. "Good for him." Dottie blinked. "You're not going to—" "He buys pie, Dottie. He's a customer." Dottie pressed her lips together in a way that said she had plenty more to add, but recognized she wasn't going to get the reaction she was looking for. She went back to her preserves. Mara finished packing up her table. She thought once about the quiet nod he gave her every Sunday. The quarter, always exact, always a quarter. The way he said "good crust" and walked away before she could respond. She folded her cloth and told herself it meant nothing. A man like that, 3,000 acres, 6 years of keeping to himself, didn't come to the Sunday market because of anything a woman like her represented. He came because he liked apple pie. That was all. January arrived with cold that cracked the water in the outdoor trough before dawn, and Mara spent 3 mornings in a row wrestling frozen pump handles and patching the gap under the barn door where the wind came through mean and thin. She was running on 4 hours of sleep by the Saturday before market day, and she almost didn't bake that week. She baked anyway. She baked because the rent on her equipment loan was due, because the pig feed was nearly gone, and because she had never in her life given herself permission to simply stop. She put the pies in the wagon before the sun was fully up and drove to town through cold that made the horse miserable and made her jaw ache from keeping her teeth together. She set up her table. She sold 3 pies before noon. By mid-morning, when the market square was busy and loud and her hands were cold, even through her gloves, the Sunday man came. He looked at her differently that morning. Not long. Just a second. The way a person looks when they notice something they didn't expect to notice. "Slice of apple," he said. "I'm out of apple." She said it before she remembered to be apologetic about it. "Cherry and mixed berry." "Cherry's better." A pause. "Cherry, then." She cut his slice, wrapped it. He put his quarter on the table, but he didn't leave immediately. He stood there for a moment with the wrapped pie in his hand, and he looked at her face, not at the table, and he said, "You look tired." It wasn't delivered as sympathy. It wasn't delivered as an insult. It was said the way someone says something they observed and decided, for reasons of their own, to say out loud instead of keeping in. Mara looked at him. "I am tired," she said. "Thank you for noticing." He nodded once. He walked to the livery post. He stood there for longer than usual that Sunday. She caught herself glancing over twice without meaning to. The third time she looked, he was gone. She sold the rest of her pies by 2 o'clock and drove home through cold that had gotten meaner and thought, against her will, about a man who noticed she was tired and said so without making it into anything. February brought mud and then a hard freeze that came back after the mud, which was the worst possible order for a homestead. The fence on the east line had been leaning for 2 weeks, and Mara had been putting off dealing with it because every time she got to it, something more urgent pulled her back to the house or the barn. She planned to fix it herself, the way she fixed everything herself, when the ground thawed enough to let her work the post. The fence was not fixed when she woke up one Sunday morning to find that 2 of her pigs had gotten through the gap in the night. She found them both before noon, one in the Harlan field a 1/4 mile north, one standing in the road looking confused. And she got them back, and she got the fence patched with wire that wasn't pretty but would hold. And she arrived at the market an hour and a half late with flour on her sleeve and mud on her boots, and her hair partially escaped from its braid. She was setting up her table, fast, not bothering with the full cloth, just getting pies down and sign up, when she looked up and saw the Sunday man standing at the edge of the square. He'd been waiting. She could see it in the way he was standing, not browsing, not moving from stall to stall, just standing, in a spot where he could see her table. He walked over when she was halfway set up. "Late," he said, not as a criticism, just as an acknowledgement. "Pigs got out," she said. "Fixed it." Something moved behind his eyes. He reached into his coat. "Apple's ready," she said, cutting before he asked. He watched her cut the slice, watched her wrap it. He put the quarter down. Then he said unexpectedly, "The south road past Carver Creek. There's a rut in it that's going to break an axle before spring if nobody deals with it." She looked at him. "Which section?" "Just past the cottonwood stand. You come through there on Sunday mornings?" "Every week." He nodded, picked up his pie, walked away. That Tuesday, someone had filled the rut. Not with dirt that would wash away in the next rain, but with gravel and flat stone, packed down properly, the way a man who knew land maintenance did it when he was doing it right. There was no note, no explanation. Mara drove over the repaired road that Sunday and felt something she didn't have immediate words for, something between gratitude and unease, the feeling of being seen doing something difficult by someone who didn't make you feel watched. She didn't say anything when he came to the table. Neither did he, but she'd started wrapping his slice before he reached her, and he'd stopped pretending he was going to go anywhere else when he arrived at the market. The whispers started in March. She heard the first one from Dottie, who at least had the decency to tell her directly, rather than let it reach her through channels. "People are talking," Dottie said, coming to Mara's table when the crowd had thinned. "About you and Gideon Rourke." Mara kept her eyes on her work. "People talk about everything. They're saying he comes to your table because he's lonely, that you're reading something into it that isn't there." Dottie's voice was careful, not cruel, but not entirely protective either. "I'm telling you because I'd want to know." Mara set down the pie tin. She looked at Dottie. "I haven't said anything to anyone about Gideon Rourke." "I know." "Then whatever people are reading into, they're reading it without my help." Dottie had the grace to look slightly ashamed. She went back to her table. Lenora Pike was less careful about it. Lenora was a woman of 40-some years with a fine house and a dead husband who'd left her enough money to be comfortable and enough idle time to be dangerous. She had a voice that carried and opinions she'd never been asked to keep quiet, and she'd taken a particular interest in Mara Bellamy for reasons Mara had never fully understood. Whether it was dislike or something uglier dressed up as dislike, she couldn't say. The Sunday Lenora said what she said, loudly, across 3 stalls, clearly intended to land, was the Sunday Mara kept her hands moving and her face down and refused to give Lenora Pike the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. But it cost her something. It cost her the careful, constructed sense she'd built over weeks. That maybe, what was happening at her table on Sunday mornings was simply 2 people existing near each other in a way that didn't need to be explained or defended. Lenora had taken that and made it ridiculous. And the worst part was that Mara couldn't say for certain she was wrong. Well, she told herself she would stop noticing when he arrived. She told herself this on a Thursday, at her kitchen table, with flour on her hands, and the kind of clarity that comes in the middle of a sleepless night when you've been honest with yourself for a change. Gideon Rourke was a widower with 3,000 acres and 6 years of silence behind him. He came to her table because he liked pie. Whatever small kindnesses had passed between them, the road, the coffee she'd left on her fence post one Tuesday, when she'd seen him passing in the early morning, the cornbread he'd left in a cloth by her gate 3 days later, those were the habits of neighbors, not the gestures of a man with intentions. She was doing what women like her always did, she decided. She was finding meaning in attention because she had been so thoroughly trained to expect none. She went to bed determined and woke up Sunday and was watching the road from the market square before she'd consciously made the decision to look. He came at 9:43. She knew because she'd already looked at the clock on the dry goods store wall twice. She had his slice cut and wrapped before he was halfway across the square. He reached the table. He looked at the wrapped slice, then at her face. Something flickered. "You look like you made a decision," he said. She blinked. "What?" "About something. You've got that look." She stared at him. "I don't know what look you mean." "The one that means you've talked yourself into or out of something and you're not happy about either option." The accuracy of that landed somewhere uncomfortable. She handed him the slice. 20 cents. He put the quarter down. He didn't leave right away. "My name's Gideon Rourke," he said, just like that. Plainly, like a man who'd been holding that back for a while and decided today was the day. "I know," she said. "I'm Mara Bellamy." "I know," he said. A beat of something passed between them, not charged exactly, but full. Like a room where all the windows have been closed and someone has just opened one. He picked up his pie. "Good morning, Mara Bellamy," he said. He walked back to the livery post. She picked up the quarter from the cloth and put it in her apron pocket and thought, with a feeling she absolutely refused to name, that whatever this was, it was not nothing. She was not fool enough to call it something, but she was not honest enough to keep calling it nothing. And that, right there, standing at a wooden table in the cold Montana morning, with a quarter in her apron and Lenora Pike's voice still ringing somewhere in the back of her memory, that was where the trouble really started. The quarter became a kind of ritual. Not the coin itself. Mara wasn't sentimental about money, couldn't afford to be. But the moment of it. The way he set it down without being asked, without making her feel like she was receiving charity, without the particular performance some men made of paying a woman fairly, like they expected a medal for the basic act. He just put it on the cloth and waited for his pie, and that was it. No theater. No condescension dressed up as courtesy. She started noticing other things she hadn't let herself notice before. He arrived at the same time every Sunday. Not exactly, not to the minute, but within a narrow window, 7 minutes either side of 10 o'clock. She knew this because she'd stopped pretending she wasn't tracking it. He came from the north end of the square, always on foot from wherever he tied his horse, always alone. He wore the same coat through the worst of winter, heavy canvas with a collar that had been repaired at one shoulder with thread that didn't quite match. His boots were resoled but not new. A man who spent money on the things that needed spending on and not on appearance. He didn't browse the other stalls. He came for pie, and he left after pie. And for the first 2 months that was the entire shape of it. But the shape had been changing. It had started with the road. Then with the cornbread she'd left on the fence post, she still wasn't entirely sure why she'd done that, only that she'd had extra, and the alternative was to eat it herself for 3 days running, and she'd told herself it was purely practical, a matter of not wasting food, and the part of her brain that was honest had listened to this explanation with the patience of someone waiting for a child to finish a story they don't believe. He'd left cornbread back at her gate 2 mornings later, wrapped in a cloth so clean she felt slightly ashamed of the state of her own kitchen rags. The cloth was what broke her composure. Not in any visible way. She didn't do anything embarrassing, didn't say anything to Dottie or anyone else, didn't let it become a thing. But she'd stood at her gate with that neatly folded cloth in her hands and thought, with a feeling she recognized as dangerous, he went home and washed this before he returned it. That was not the behavior of a man who thought of her as nothing. The question was what it was the behavior of, and she didn't trust herself to answer that honestly. The coffee was her idea, and she made it impulsively, which was unlike her. It was a Tuesday in late February, bitter cold, one of those mornings where the sky was the color of pewter and the wind had teeth. She'd seen him from the kitchen window. Or rather, she'd seen his horse, the big roan, moving along the road at the pace of a man who wasn't in a hurry but wasn't stopping either. She'd recognized the horse before she'd recognized the man, which told her something about how much attention she'd been paying that she hadn't admitted. She'd poured a tin cup of coffee, hot, fresh, she'd just made it, and she'd walked to the fence post at the edge of her property and set it there and gone back inside. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She just put the cup on the post and returned to her kitchen and told herself she was being neighborly, and the alternative was letting a man ride past in 20 below weather without so much as acknowledging the existence of hot beverages. She watched from the window. He saw the cup before he reached the post. She could tell by the way he slowed. He pulled up, looked at the cup, looked at the house. She stepped back from the window. And then he dismounted and picked up the cup and drank it there in the road, in the cold, without moving on, like he was thinking about something. He set the cup back on the post when he was done. He remounted. He rode on. She retrieved the cup. It was still faintly warm. She washed it and set it to dry and didn't think about it again for approximately 4 minutes, after which she thought about it for the rest of the morning. The Sunday after that, he put the quarter on the cloth and then said, without looking up from the pie, "The coffee was good." "It was just coffee," she said. "It was good coffee," he said. He picked up his slice and walked away. She stood there for a moment with a woman named Harriet Sims waiting to buy a cherry pie and completely failing to notice her. "Mara," Harriet said. "Sorry." Mara turned back. "Sorry, Harriet. Cherry, was it?" She cut the pie. She made change. She did not look toward the livery post. She looked toward the livery post. He was watching the square, not her, or if he was watching her, he'd shifted by the time her gaze crossed the distance. But there was something in how he was standing that was different from the early weeks. Less like a man waiting for a transaction to be done so he could leave. More like a man who was exactly where he'd meant to be. She told herself she was imagining it. She'd been telling herself that for 4 months. The first real conversation happened without either of them planning it. It was a Sunday in March when a late cold snap had driven half the market indoors and left Mara standing at her table in a coat she'd patched at both elbows and a scarf that had belonged to her mother. She'd sold well. Cold weather made people want comfort, and her pies were what comfort looked like at the Garrison Sunday market. But by 11 o'clock the crowd had thinned badly, and she was standing with her hands in her pockets and not much to do. Gideon came at his usual time. She had his slice ready. He paid. But when he picked up the wrapped pie, he didn't walk back to the livery post. He looked at the empty table beside her. The rope seller had packed up early, and he said, "Can I stand here?" It wasn't quite a question. "It's a free market," she said. He stood beside the table and ate his pie and looked at the square. She stood behind her table and looked at the square. For a stretch of time that might have been 5 minutes or 15, neither of them spoke, and it was not comfortable exactly, but not uncomfortable. Like two people who had been introduced to the same kind of silence before and knew how to share it. Then he said, "How long have you been doing this?" 4 years, she said. "Started the season after Thomas died." "Thomas was your husband?" "Yes." A pause. Not an awkward one. He was chewing something over. "Mine was Eleanor," he said. 6 years ago." Mara looked at him sideways. He was still looking at the square. "I know," she said. "Dottie Crane told me." Something that might have been a very small, very dry laugh moved across his face. "Dottie tells everyone everything." "She does," Mara agreed. "What she told me was accurate, though. She's not malicious. She's just porous." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is your homestead east, past the Carver Road junction?" "About a mile past it." He nodded. "I thought so. I've seen your wagon on Tuesday mornings." "You ride that road regular?" "When I'm checking the north fence line." She processed this. The north fence line of his property, if it went as far as she understood the Rourke spread to go, would not require him to come within a mile of Carver Creek Junction unless he took the longer way around. She filed this observation away without commenting on it. "The fence you fixed," she said instead. "The rut." "The one I had Cole fix," he said. "My hand. I told him about it." She looked at him. "Why?" He turned then and met her eyes for the first time that morning. Not a long look, just a direct one. Because it needed fixing, and it hadn't been fixed. That was the whole answer, apparently. He looked back at the square. Mara stood with her hands in her coat pockets and felt something she recognized reluctantly as being moved. Not dramatically. Not in the way of romantic stories people told each other at socials. In the quiet way. The way you feel when someone does something practical for you without wrapping it in debt or expectation, and you understand without being told that they simply saw something that needed doing and did it because they could. She didn't say thank you. She'd already done that weeks ago, in her head, in her kitchen, while standing at the gate with a freshly washed cloth in her hands. "Your spring planting started?" he asked. "Last week. Ground's still half frozen, but I got the early beds in." "What do you grow?" "Mostly what keeps. Root vegetables, squash. Apple trees are mine. I planted them 6 years ago when Thomas got sick, before—" She stopped. "We thought we'd have more time." He didn't fill the pause with noise, which she appreciated. "The orchard takes a lot of work," she said after a moment. "But it pays. The apples pay." "I can tell," he said. "From the pie." She looked at him. "The crust is good," he said. "But the filling? Whatever you do with those apples, it's right." "I add a little cider to it," she said, "from the press. And I don't cook them down all the way before they go in. Most people overcook the apples." He nodded slowly, like this was information he was actually keeping. "Do you cook?" she asked, because she was curious and had stopped pretending she wasn't curious about things. "Badly," he said. "I manage. My hands eat better than I do." "You cook for your ranch hands. I do right by the men who work for me." This landed simply, without drama, but it landed. A man who makes sure other people eat before himself doesn't usually announce it that way. He said it like a fact, not a virtue. "I should get back," he said, after another beat. He picked up his hat, which he'd set on the corner of her table without asking, and she hadn't told him not to. "Thank you for the pie, Mara." "Thank you for the quarter, Gideon," she said. He almost smiled. She was almost certain of it. Then he walked back across the square and she watched him go and thought about how long it had been since someone had stood beside her without needing something from her, without performing friendliness or charity or pity, without making her feel like a woman who needed to justify her presence on the earth. Just stood beside her, like it was the most natural thing. The whispers that had started in late winter had not died down by April. They had evolved. Now they were not just whispers about Gideon being lonely or Mara being foolish enough to misread kindness. Now they had developed a structure, a narrative, the way gossip does when it finds good material and a willing audience. The story, as it circulated through Garrison's tea tables and front porches and the back rooms of the dry goods store, went approximately like this. Gideon Rourke, a grieving man of property and standing, had been taking his Sunday pie from Mara Bellamy out of a kind of absent habit, the way a man might stop at the same bench every day without particularly choosing to. And Mara Bellamy, a strong woman certainly, a hard-working woman, a woman who had managed alone admirably. But let's be clear, a woman who was not exactly what men came looking for, had built something in her head out of those weekly transactions that wasn't there. And it was, in the parlance of those telling the story, a little sad. Lenora Pike did not invent this version of events, but she refined it. "She's a practical woman," Lenora told anyone who would listen, which was enough people to matter. But practicality isn't everything a man wants in a wife. He needs someone he can take pride in, someone who— a meaningful pause followed by a gesture that communicated more than she was willing to say directly. The gesture communicated someone who looks like less of Mara Bellamy. Mara heard some of this through Dottie, who reported it with the discomfort of a person who feels guilty for knowing something but couldn't quite stop herself from sharing it. Mara heard the rest through the particular quality of silence that fell in certain establishments when she walked in. The 2-second pause, the shifted eyes, the resumption of conversation at a slightly different pitch. She had grown up knowing that silence. It was the silence that said, "We were just talking about you." She had developed, over the years, a very good face for it. Straight on, eyes clear, no hurry. She'd learned that the worst thing you could do when people were waiting for you to be embarrassed was to give them the embarrassment they'd come for. But it wore at her. Not in the way of a wound, but more in the way of weather, the persistent kind that doesn't destroy but erodes, wearing down the edges of things you'd thought were solid. She found herself, on a quiet Wednesday, standing in front of the small mirror in her bedroom, not doing anything particular, just looking. and she thought, with a clarity she'd been avoiding, is Lenora Pike right? Not about Gideon's intentions. She didn't know about those, and she'd made peace with not knowing. But about the larger thing. About whether a man of any standing, any real standing, would look at Mara Bellamy, with her wide hips and her patched coat and her table at the Sunday market and her 5-mile homestead, and see something worth choosing. She looked at herself for a long moment. Then she turned away and went to split wood because the wood wasn't going to split itself, and because looking in mirrors for long periods of time had never once improved her actual situation. It was Gideon who addressed the whispers, and he did it the way he did most things, directly, without warning, and without asking Mara's permission first, which she found equal parts infuriating and, privately, something else. He'd heard something in town. She didn't know what specifically. She found out later from Dottie, who'd been present, that it was something Lenora had said in the general store within apparent earshot of half a dozen people, and that what she'd said had been pointed enough that even some of Lenora's usual allies had gone quiet afterward. Dottie told her Gideon had been in the store buying rope, that he'd heard it, that he'd finished paying for his rope, folded the receipt, put it in his coat pocket, and then turned to the room in a way that made everyone in it pay attention without him raising his voice. Mara Bellamy, he'd said, according to Dottie, who delivered this with wide eyes and the reverence of someone who had witnessed something they hadn't expected, is not a woman who needs the town's pity or its opinion. She's a woman who runs her land alone and feeds half this valley on Sundays. Anybody who's got the time to stand around suggesting otherwise has got too much time. He'd looked, Dottie said, directly at Lenora when he said the last part. Then he'd picked up his rope and left. Mara heard this on a Thursday morning and stood with her kitchen rag in her hand for a full minute without moving. She wasn't sure how she felt. She was grateful. The part of her that had spent the winter holding Lenora's voice at arm's length felt something loosen when she heard that someone had pushed back. But she was also unsettled. She hadn't asked him to do that. She hadn't known he was going to. And something about being defended, even accurately, even well, by someone who hadn't told her they were going to do it, made her feel not diminished exactly, but like a version of herself who stood on the outside of her own situation. She wasn't fragile. She didn't need Gideon Rourke to fight her battles. But she also couldn't entirely ignore that he had done it, and that the way Dottie described it, he looked directly at Lenora, did something to the very practical, very guarded part of her heart that she'd been asking to please be quiet since November sob. She saw him the following Sunday, and she could tell, from the way he came to the table, that he was waiting to see if she'd say something about it. She cut his slice. She wrapped it. She put it on the cloth. She looked at him. "I heard what you said in the general store," she said. He held her gaze. "I know you did. Dottie Crane." "Dottie Crane," she agreed. "You could have told me you were going to say something." "Would you have wanted me to?" She thought about it honestly. "No, I'd have told you not to. That's why I didn't tell you." She picked up the quarter he'd set down and turned it in her fingers once. "I handle my own business, Gideon." "I know that," he said. "What I said wasn't about your business. It was about what I'm not going to stand in a room and listen to." The distinction landed. She felt it land. "All right," she said. She set the quarter in her apron pocket. "Thank you." He nodded. He picked up his pie. Then she said, before she'd made any decision to say it, "Would you like to sit down? I've got a second stool back here." He looked at the stool. He looked at her. The briefest hesitation shot, not reluctance, more like a man recalibrating something. "Yes," he said. "I would." He came around the table and sat on the second stool, and Mara went back to her work, and they sat in the same shared silence they'd found in March, except this time it was at her table, on her side of the cloth, and that difference was not small. The problem was that they both had wounds they hadn't finished carrying, and wounds like that are heavy in ways that don't always show on the outside. Mara had spent 4 years making herself indispensable because it was the only relationship model she completely trusted. Indispensable was safe. Indispensable meant you couldn't be set aside, because setting you aside would cost something. She had built her entire presence in Garrison on this principle, the woman who fixed things, baked things, managed things. And it worked, in its way. People respected her. People relied on her. Nobody left her out of anything that required her skills. But nobody came looking for her at the end of a long day just because they wanted to. Nobody left a note or sent a letter or stood at the edge of a market square 7 minutes before 10 on a Sunday because they'd been looking forward to it all week. She understood this, finally, at nearly 29 years old, sitting at her own pie table with a widowed rancher eating cherry pie on a stool beside her. She understood it, and it scared her in a way that nothing practical, not frozen pumps or escaped pigs or bad harvests, had ever scared her. Practical problems had practical solutions. This did not. Gideon had his own version of the same problem, though she was only beginning to understand its shape. He talked about Eleanor once in April, when they'd fallen into the habit of him sitting with her for an hour or so after the market crowd thinned. Not talking constantly, neither of them was built for that, but present, trading back and forth, the way people do when they've gotten past the performance of conversation and arrived at the actual thing. He said it sideways, the way he said most things. They'd been talking about the spring, the late frost, the damage to her early beds, and he'd said something about Eleanor's kitchen garden, how she'd kept it obsessively through bad weather, how she'd mourned the plants that didn't make it as if they were something she'd personally failed. He stopped speaking after that for a moment, just let it sit there. She sounds like someone who cared a lot about things, Mara said. She did, he said. Everything she cared about completely. That's a hard way to lose someone, Mara said, when they were that fully themselves. He looked at her. A different look than the brief ones she'd catalogued. Longer, more open, like she'd said something he hadn't expected to hear from anyone. Yes, he said. That's exactly what it is. She didn't say anything else about it. She didn't try to improve on what he'd just said or offer him something to replace the weight of it. She knew better than that. You can't replace a loss by handing someone comfort. You can only sit near them while they carry it, which is a different thing, and in some ways the harder thing. He appreciated it. She could tell. Not from anything he said, but from the quality of the silence that came after, which was not the silence of a conversation that had ended badly, but of one that had been completed. She thought about Thomas that night. She thought about what he'd been, his patience, his ridiculous optimism about the apple trees, the way he'd named the pigs, and then been sad every time one had to be sold. She thought about what the 4 years without him had done to her, not the grief exactly, but the specific shape of the habit of being alone, how thoroughly she'd rebuilt herself around the fact of her own solitude, how well she'd furnished the rooms of it, how accustomed she'd gotten to the sound of her own footsteps as the only footsteps in the house. And she thought about how strange it was that the thing scaring her wasn't the possibility of losing that solitude. It was the possibility that she'd already started to want to. He came to the homestead for the first time on a Saturday in May. She hadn't invited him. He'd sent word ahead, a note, passed through Cole, his ranch hand, who appeared at her gate early in the week with a folded piece of paper and the expression of a man trying very hard to look like this was a routine errand. The note was short. It said that the east road past Carver Creek had another section that needed attention and that he'd be working it Saturday, and would it be all right if he stopped in, afterward, to check whether she'd had any further trouble with the section he'd repaired in February. Mara read this note twice. The section repaired in February had been completely fine for 3 months. He knew that, because she'd mentioned it. He was fabricating a reason. She wrote back, "Saturday is fine. I'll have coffee." He arrived at 2 in the afternoon, which told her he'd actually done some work on the road before coming, which told her the fabricated reason had at least been partly honest, which was such a specific and Gideon-like way to manage something that she almost laughed when he rode up. He tied his horse. He looked at the homestead, not assessingly, more like a man absorbing a place he'd built a picture of in his head and was now comparing to the real thing. She watched him from the porch. "Coffee's inside," she said. He came up to the porch. He stopped at the edge of it, uninvited still, which she noticed. "Come in," she said. "It's warmer." He sat at her kitchen table and looked at the room. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat down across from him. The kitchen was plain and scrubbed clean, and there were dried apple rings hanging near the window because there were always dried apple rings hanging near the window at some point in the year. He looked at those. "How many trees?" he said. 16, she said. 7 were Thomas's. I planted 9. "Which ones?" She pointed to the window, though you couldn't see the orchard from where they were sitting. "The ones along the south fence. He wanted the north side. I wanted better drainage." "Were you right?" "The south ones have outproduced the north ones every year since they matured," she said. So yes, something like quiet satisfaction moved through his expression. You don't need much encouragement to tell someone when you're right. Would you bother telling me if you weren't? He picked up his coffee. No, he said. I probably wouldn't. They sat. The kitchen held the late afternoon light in the way kitchens do when they've been heated all day. Warmly, fully, like something cupped in two hands. She'd baked that morning, and the smell of it was still in the air. He noticed. She could tell. You work every day, he said. It wasn't a criticism. Homestead doesn't take days off, she said. You know that. I do. He was quiet for a moment. Don't you ever, he stopped. What? He turned the cup in his hands. Get tired of it. Not the work, just the single-handedness of it. She looked at him across the table. Every day, she said, without thinking about whether to say it. But tired doesn't mean it needs to be different, just means it's heavy. He nodded slowly. He understood that. She could see that he understood it the way you understand something you've been carrying yourself. There's a blue scarf, he said, after a moment. Just that. She waited. Eleanor's, it's still in the house, on a hook inside the front door where she used to hang it. He wasn't looking at the window now. He was looking at the table, at his hands. 6 years and I haven't moved it. Every morning I walk past it. Every morning I tell myself, he stopped. That you'll do it when you're ready, she said. He looked at her. I kept Thomas's boots, she said, by the back door. For 2.5 years. They had mud on them still, from the last time he wore them. One morning I cleaned the mud off and brought them inside and put them in the chest at the foot of the bed. She held his gaze. Not because I was over it, because I needed the back door back. He was very still. The scarf doesn't have to move, she said, but it also doesn't have to mean everything forever. He looked at her for a long time. Something in his face was doing something she couldn't quite read. Not breaking, not releasing, but shifting, in the way that deep-set things shift when the ground moves under them. I don't know, he said finally, what I am anymore. On the other side of it. You're what you've been doing, she said. Every day since. That's what's left. He let that settle. She let him let it settle. Outside, a horse moved in the yard. His horse, shifting at the post. And the sound of it brought the outside back in. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. They sat there until the light changed, neither of them in a hurry to be anywhere else, which was a thing neither of them had been able to say about a Saturday afternoon in a very long time. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was two people with incomplete histories sitting in a warm kitchen talking about the things they couldn't put down yet. But it was the first time Mara had sat at her own table and felt, with someone else across from it, that the room was the right size. And it was the first time in 6 years that Gideon Rourke had talked about Eleanor's scarf out loud, to anyone, including himself. Neither of them said so. Neither of them needed to. But when he left, and she stood on the porch watching him ride back toward the north fence line in the late afternoon, Mara was aware that something had shifted in the specific weight of her own solitude. It was not gone. It was not solved. It was just slightly different in her hands than it had been that morning. She went back inside. She looked at the 2 cups on the table. She washed them both, slowly, and put them away, and stood in her kitchen for a moment before going back to work. The Saturday in May became a pattern without either of them deciding it would. Not every Saturday. He didn't presume that, and she wouldn't have wanted him to. But most of them, through the late spring and into June, he came by in the afternoon after whatever work had pulled him through that end of the valley, and she had coffee ready because she'd started making extra on Saturday afternoons without acknowledging to herself why, and they sat at her kitchen table and talked the way they'd found how to talk, without performance, without filling silence for the sake of it, without either of them trying to be something other than what they were. He helped her fix the barn roof in late May. She hadn't asked him to. He'd arrived on a Saturday to find her on the ladder herself, and he'd stood at the base of it for a moment with an expression she'd come to recognize as him deciding something, and then he'd asked where she kept her extra nails and climbed up beside her, and they'd worked the whole section together without discussing it. When they were done, he'd climbed down and washed his hands at the pump and accepted the coffee she brought out without commenting on the fact that she'd brought it without being asked. She paid him back by staying 2 extra hours the following Tuesday to help Cole in his other hand move a section of collapsed fence on the north property line, because Gideon had mentioned it on Saturday as a problem he hadn't gotten to yet, and she'd driven past with her wagon on Tuesday and stopped and climbed down and worked beside the two ranch hands until the section was reset. Cole had looked at her with the particular expression of a young man trying to figure out what the social rules were, and she'd answered his unasked question by handing him the next post stake and saying, "You're setting these too shallow. Another frost and they'll heave again." Cole had reset them the right way. He'd also, she found out later from Dottie, told Gideon that the Bellamy woman knew fence work better than most men he'd worked alongside, which Dottie had delivered with barely concealed delight, and which Mara had filed away with the private satisfaction of someone who'd spent years being quietly underestimated. The Sunday market continued. He still came at 10 o'clock. He still sat on the second stool behind her table when the crowd thinned. But the nature of it had changed in the way that things change when you stop pretending they're something smaller than they are. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but with a kind of settling, the way a house settles into its foundation over time and becomes something you can trust to hold you. The town noticed this too. Of course it did. Lenora Pike had not forgiven Gideon for what he'd said in the general store. This was the thing about a woman like Lenora. She did not update her position when presented with evidence against it. She refined it. She found new angles. She waited for cracks. The crack she settled on was this. Mara Bellamy was a woman who had made herself convenient to a lonely man, and convenience was not the same as worth. And eventually, Lenora said at tea tables across town, a man of Gideon Rourke's standing would wake up to the difference. Mara heard this version circulating in early June, and for the first time since the whispers had started, she didn't work to hold it at arm's length. She sat with it. She turned it over honestly, the way you do with things that have a chance of being true, because the ones that are entirely false don't need that kind of examination. Was she convenient? She thought about the barn roof, the coffee on the fence post, the Saturday afternoons that had built themselves out of small practical justifications, the road, the fence, the roof, until the justifications had become thin enough to see through. She was, she admitted, extremely useful. She'd been useful her whole life. Useful was her native language. The question that kept her up on a Wednesday night in June, with the window open and the summer air coming through warm and heavy, was whether Gideon Rourke knew the difference between useful and wanted, and whether, if she was honest, she did either. She didn't arrive at an answer that night. She got up before dawn and baked, which was what she did when she couldn't sleep, and by the time the sun was up, she had 4 pies cooling on the rack, and the question still sitting at the back of her chest like something she'd swallowed wrong. June turned brutal early. Montana summers could do that, tease through May with something almost pleasant, and then arrive in full force the first week of June with a heat that had no mercy in it, the kind that made the air above the road shimmer and cracked the mudflats west of town into patterns like broken pottery. Mara's well was holding, but just. She'd been monitoring the water level every morning, measuring against the mark she'd scratched into the stone 4 years ago, when Thomas had taught her how to read a well's depth by feel and sound, before he got sick enough that teaching was all he had left to offer. She drove the 5 miles to market each Sunday in heat that made the horse slow and made her dress cling to her back before she'd gotten halfway. She sold pies. She sat behind her table. She watched the north end of the square. He came, every Sunday. But in the second week of June, something changed in how he came. There was a tightness around his eyes she hadn't seen before, not visible to anyone not paying the kind of attention she paid, which was more attention than she'd admitted to herself. He was tired in a way that went beyond a hard week's work. He took his pie and sat on the stool and said less than usual, which for Gideon meant sitting in almost complete silence with his hands around his cup of water and his gaze somewhere past the square. "Something wrong?" she asked, between customers. "Fence line," he said. "Long section on the east boundary. Took longer than it should have." She looked at him. The circles under his eyes, the way his shoulders were carrying something. "When did you last eat a full meal?" she said. He glanced at her. "I eat." That didn't answer the question. He was quiet for a moment. "Tuesday, probably." It was Sunday. She cut him a second slice without asking and set it on the cloth in front of him. He looked at it. "I didn't ask for—" "I know," she said. He ate it. She went back to her customers and didn't make anything of it, and neither did he. But she thought about that look, the specific flatness of exhaustion in his eyes, the way a man looks when he's been running hard in the wrong direction and hasn't admitted it yet, for the whole drive home. The first Sunday he didn't come, she told herself it was nothing. Men missed market days. Ranches had emergencies. She'd missed her own share of Sundays when something had pulled her back before dawn. One missed Sunday meant nothing. She packed up at 2 o'clock, loaded the remaining pies into the wagon, and drove home on the Carver Creek Road at a steady pace and told herself she was not checking the turnoff to the Rourke spread as she passed it. She checked the turnoff. Nothing looked wrong. The road was quiet. The afternoon heat pressed down on everything, flattening the grass on both sides of the rut, making the air itself feel thick. She drove home. The second Sunday, she knew before she'd gotten to the market. She didn't know how she knew, something that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with 6 months of paying close attention to a man who kept his own rhythms more precisely than any clock she'd ever owned. 2 Sundays wasn't a pattern for a normal person. For Gideon Rourke, who had come every week through cold snaps and mud season and the kind of brutal spring wind that kept half of Garrison indoors, 2 missed Sundays was wrong. She sold her pies. She made change and wrapped slices and nodded at the people who stopped to talk. She did all of this on one level of herself, while on another level, a deeper one, she was doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with pies. Last time she'd seen him, 1 week and 6 days ago. He'd looked tired. He'd admitted he wasn't eating properly. He'd been working a long fence section on the east boundary, alone, in heat that had not broken since. She packed up at noon. She turned the wagon north instead of east. She told herself she was just checking. She told herself this the way you tell yourself things you know aren't entirely true. Not lying exactly, just giving yourself permission you'd otherwise deny. The Rourke spread announced itself the way large ranches do, not with grandeur but with scale, the particular quality of land that has been worked for a long time by people who knew what they were doing with it. The house was not what she'd imagined. She'd imagined something bigger, showier, the way she'd imagined most things about Gideon before she'd known him well enough to know better. It was a solid house, well made, with a long porch and windows that caught the afternoon light. A house that had been lived in by people who intended to stay. Cole was crossing the yard when she pulled in. He saw her and stopped, and his face did something that made her stomach go cold. "Where is he?" she said. She hadn't gotten down from the wagon yet. "East fence," Cole said. "He went out day before yesterday to finish the section. Didn't come back for supper. I figured he'd camped out. He does that sometimes when he's deep in the east section. But he didn't come back yesterday either, and The young man stopped. He was scared and trying not to show it. "I was going to ride out this morning." She was already turning the wagon. "Which section?" she said. "Past the third post stand, where the land dips before the creek." "I know where that is," she said, though she'd only ridden that direction once, on a late afternoon in May when Gideon had shown her the boundary line as they'd fixed the collapsed section together. She'd paid attention the way she paid attention to everything, precisely, because information was useful and usefulness was her language. "I'll come with you," Cole said, moving toward the barn. "Saddle fast," she said. They found him 40 minutes later. He was on the ground beside a broken fence post in a section of the east boundary where the land did drop slightly into a shallow depression before flattening out again at the creek. His horse was gone. She found out later it had spooked at something and pulled free and made its way back to the barn on its own, which was how Cole had known something was wrong, because the horse coming in without Gideon was not a thing that happened. But she didn't know that yet when she climbed down from the wagon and crossed the ground toward him at something between a walk and a run, keeping her face careful, keeping her breathing even, because panicking was not going to help anything. He was on his back. His right leg was at an angle that was wrong. Not broken, she could see that much, but the knee had taken something hard. The fence post beside him had sheared off at the base, the kind of break that happened when the wood was half rotted inside and looked solid from the outside. He'd been working it. She could see from the ground disturbed around it, and it had come apart and caught him somehow on the way down. Caught him, and taken the knee with it and put him on the ground in heat that had not dropped below 90 degrees in 4 days. He was conscious. That was the first thing she checked. His eyes opened when she came close, and there was a moment where they struggled to focus, and then they found her face. "Mara," he said. His voice was rough. Badly dehydrated, she registered, which for a man who'd been on the ground in this heat for somewhere near 18 hours was not a small thing. "Don't talk yet," she said. She was already checking, hands on his leg first, reading the damage the way Thomas had taught her to read an injury before you move someone, because moving wrong could make the difference between an injury and something you didn't come back from. The knee was swollen, badly, the kind of swelling that meant real damage, but it was swelling, not deformity, which meant the joint was intact. His breathing was shallow but steady. His skin was hot and dry in the way of someone who'd sweated through everything they had and had nothing left. Cole was beside her. "We need to get him into the wagon," she said. "We need water first. How much did you bring?" Cole had a canteen. She took it, tilted Gideon's head, got him to drink in small amounts, which he did with the concentrated effort of a man whose body had moved past the point of thirst into the flat territory on the other side of it, where you don't feel much of anything. "More," she said when he stopped. Slowly. "More." Getting him into the wagon took 20 minutes, and it was not easy, and it was not clean. Gideon was not a small man, and his knee was not cooperating, and at one point he made a sound when they moved his leg that Mara absorbed without comment, and Cole flinched from with visible distress. She told Cole to hold the line, and she took the weight herself on the last lift, getting under Gideon's arm with her shoulder and moving him the final foot into the wagon bed with what must have looked from the outside like more strength than she was supposed to have. She didn't think about the looking. She thought about getting him in without making the knee worse. He was in the wagon. She climbed up to the seat. Cole mounted. "Right ahead," she said. "Get the house ready. Clean water, a basin, as many cloths as you can find. Clear the table in the front room." Cole rode. She drove. She stayed at the Rourke house that night. Not as a decision, she hadn't decided exactly, any more than she'd decided to turn the wagon north instead of east. It had simply become clear, as she worked through the afternoon and into the evening, that leaving was not something she was going to do. His fever had come on by 4 o'clock, the kind that arrives fast in a man who's been dried out by heat and rattled by injury, and a fever like that needed watching. Cole was willing but young and frightened and better used for errands than for sitting beside a sick man and knowing what to look for. Mara knew what to look for. She'd watched Thomas through 2 bad fevers in the year before he died, had learned from the doctor then what the markers were. The breathing, the color, the pattern of the temperature through the night, the point at which you made the decision to go for help versus the point where going for help was less useful than staying. She knew how to bring a fever down by degrees, how to keep a man cool and hydrated through the dark hours, how to count and wait and count again. Cole went to his bunk at midnight. She told him to. She sat beside the low bed they'd moved Gideon to in the front room, closer to the window, easier to manage. And she worked. She was good at it. She didn't think about that as a virtue, just as a fact. Her hands were steady. She knew what to do with them. Around 2 in the morning, his fever was at its worst. She could feel it in the heat rising off him, in the way his breathing had changed to something faster and shallower. And she sat in the chair beside the bed with a cloth and a basin of water. And she thought, with a clarity that came from exhaustion and from the strange stillness of a dark house in the middle of the night, that she was not afraid. She was not afraid of the fever. She was not afraid of the work. She was not afraid of this man, unconscious and vulnerable, in a way he'd never have allowed himself to be if he'd had any say in it. What she was afraid of was what came after, if there was an after. If he came through this and opened his eyes, and she had to figure out what this night meant or didn't mean, what she was doing in his house at 2 in the morning, what the last 6 months had been building toward, and whether she was brave enough to let it build where it was going. She'd been so careful, so deliberately, exhaustingly careful, not letting herself want too much, not letting herself imagine beyond the next Sunday, the next Saturday afternoon, the next cup of coffee shared in companionable quiet. She'd built herself a life around not asking for more than what was offered, and the asking she hadn't let herself do had piled up somewhere she hadn't been paying attention and was now, in the dark, making itself known. She changed the cloth. She counted his breathing. She waited. He came out of the worst of it near dawn. She knew before he was fully conscious. His breathing changed first, deepened, lost the fast, shallow quality that had been worrying her, and then his color changed, the high red draining back toward something closer to normal. and then he moved his hand on the blanket in the absent way of a man returning to himself. She was there when his eyes opened. The room was just beginning to lighten. The window above the bed showed the first gray of early morning. He looked at the ceiling, then at the window, then at her. He stared at her for a long moment without speaking. "Mara," he said. His voice was still rough but different now, present in it. "Yes," she said. "What time is it?" "Early, just past 5. He tried to move and stopped at what his knee told him. She watched him absorb that, the injury, the location, the chain of events that had led to this room. "How long?" he said. "Cole and I found you yesterday at noon. You've been in and out since then." Something moved in his face. "You stayed." She held his gaze. "Your fever peaked at 2. I wasn't going to leave you in the middle of that." He looked at her. The way he'd looked at her in the kitchen in May, that particular direct look that felt like being read accurately by someone with no interest in what he was supposed to say. He looked at her, and something in him was doing what deep-set things do when they've been moved. "I need water," he said. She got it. She helped him drink, and he let her help without making it difficult, which told her more about how bad the night had been than anything else could have. When he'd had enough, he lay back and looked at the ceiling. "You should go home," he said. "Get some rest." "When Cole wakes up," she said, "he can sit with you." "I don't need sitting with. The fever's down." "The fever's down," she agreed. "Your knee isn't going anywhere for a week. You need someone to—" "Mara." He turned his head and looked at her. "I know what I need." She looked back at him. "You need to let someone help you," she said, without deciding first that the help is a burden. He was quiet for a long time. "That," he said finally, "is not an easy thing to hear." "I know," she said. "I've been told the same thing." A long moment passed between them. Outside, the first birds had started. The room was gray and then lighter gray, and the air coming through the window had the particular coolness of a summer dawn before the heat remembered itself. "I was afraid," he said. The words came out flat, like he'd made the decision to say them while he was still deciding. She waited. "Not of the fence post." He was looking at the ceiling again. "Not of being found, or the knee, or any of that." He stopped. His jaw worked once. "In the night, when the fever was bad, I thought about what it would have been like if Cole if nobody had come. But someone came," she said. "You came," he said. "Not Cole. You." She sat with that. "Mara." He turned his head again, and his eyes were clearer than she'd seen them since before the fever, the specific clarity that comes after a body has fought something and won. "I have been afraid," he said, "of what it would mean to let somebody matter enough that losing them would—" He stopped again, and this time it took him longer to find the rest of it. "I know what it does. I've been on the other side of it. I know exactly what that costs." She leaned forward in the chair. She put her hand on the blanket beside his hand. Not on it, beside it. Close enough that he could feel the warmth without her forcing the contact. "Then don't spend the rest of your life," she said quietly, avoiding every hello. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. His hand moved on the blanket, just slightly, just enough, until his fingers were against hers. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. The room got lighter. The birds got louder. Somewhere in the barn, Cole's boots hit the floor with the sound of a young man starting his day without knowing what the night had held. Mara sat in the chair with her fingers against Gideon's and the early morning light coming through the window of Eleanor's house, and thought that this was not the end of anything. This was not a resolution or a rescue or a moment from which everything would now be simpler. Both of them had too much damage for simpler. But it was something. It was a door that had been standing half-closed for 6 months, and neither of them had shut it. And now, in the gray of a June morning after the longest night either of them had spent in years, they were standing close enough to it that the air from the other side was reaching them. That was not nothing. That had never been nothing. Cole came in at 5:30 and found Mara in the chair beside the bed and Gideon awake and their hands near each other on the blanket, in the particular stillness of two people who have arrived somewhere without quite knowing how they got there. Cole, to his considerable credit, said only, "I'll get the coffee on," and went to the kitchen. Gideon made a sound that was the closest thing to a genuine laugh she'd heard from him. Brief, low, almost surprised out of him. Mara sat back in her chair. She felt the absence of his fingers against hers as a specific physical thing, which told her something she'd been in the process of admitting for longer than she cared to calculate. "I need to go home," she said. "My animals." "I know," he said. "The knee needs to be looked at, properly. Don't let it go because you don't want the bother." "I won't." She stood. She picked up the basin and cloth, carrying them the way she carried everything, practically, fully, because things needed to be carried, and standing there holding them while someone else did it wasn't in her. "Mara." His voice caught her at the door. She turned. "Thank you," he said. Just that. Plainly, without embellishment, which was the only way anything he said carried the weight it was meant to carry. She stood in the doorway with the basin in her hands and looked at him in the morning light. This man with his injured knee and his fever-pale face and his 6 years of careful solitude and his blue scarf on the hook inside the front door. And she thought that she had spent 4 years believing the particular lie that she was not the kind of woman things happened to. She was beginning to think that was someone else's lie she'd borrowed. "Get some sleep," she said. "And eat something when Cole brings you food, all of it. Don't just manage." He nodded. She went to the kitchen. Cole had coffee ready, and she drank it standing, quickly, because she had 5 miles between here and animals that needed feeding, and because if she sat down, she might not be able to do what was necessary and leave. She drove home through the early morning with the heat already starting and the road pale and quiet and her hands on the reins and her mind still somewhere in the gray front room of a house that wasn't hers. She got home. She fed the animals. She sat at her kitchen table for 10 minutes with nothing in her hands. Then she got up and started the day. But something had changed in the weight of her own solitude again. It had changed in the kitchen in May, and it had changed again in the darkness of that front room, and now it sat differently in her chest. Not like a house she'd furnished carefully against the cold, but like a door she'd stopped pretending she didn't know how to open. She was not ready to open it. She wasn't sure she knew how, but she had stopped lying to herself about whether she wanted to. He was off his feet for 10 days. She knew this because Cole sent word on the 3rd day. A short note, functional, the way Cole communicated everything, reporting that Gideon was upright but not mobile, and that the doctor from town had come and confirmed the knee was badly strained but intact, and that he needed to stay off it or risk making it permanent. The note ended with, "He says he's fine." He is not fine. Mara read this at her kitchen table and thought about the specific stubbornness of a man who had run 3,000 acres alone for 6 years and had developed, during that time, a relationship with his own limitations that amounted to a polite refusal to acknowledge them. She drove out on the 4th day with a crate in the back of the wagon. She hadn't planned to. She'd planned to send food through Cole and leave it at that. Practical, neighborly, nothing that required her to walk through that door again and sit in that front room and manage whatever the morning after the long night had left between them. But she'd been baking anyway, and she'd made too much. And she'd told herself the surplus had to go somewhere useful, and the part of herself that was honest had said, quietly and without drama, "Just go." She went. Cole met her at the gate with the expression of a man who was genuinely glad to see her and doing his best not to make too much of it. She handed him half the crate and carried the rest herself to the porch, and she knocked because it was not her house, and after a moment Gideon's voice came from inside. "It's open." He was in the front room, in the chair by the window, with his leg elevated on a low stool and a look on his face that she recognized as a man caught being less capable than he preferred. He had a book in his lap that he'd clearly not been reading. The room was clean. Cole kept it clean, but it had the particular stillness of a space where someone had been sitting for too many hours running. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I was in the area," she said. He looked at her. "That's not true," she said, "but the food is real." She set the crate on the table and began unpacking it without asking permission, which she'd decided on the drive over was the correct approach, because asking permission gave him the opportunity to decline, and he was the type to decline things out of principle even when he needed them. He watched her. He didn't tell her to stop. "How's the knee?" she said. "Better than it was." That's not a useful answer. "The doctor says 3 more weeks before I can work the fence line." "Are you going to listen to him?" A pause. "Probably." She turned and looked at him. He had the look of a man who had been sitting alone with something for 4 days and hadn't made peace with it yet. Not the knee. She knew his face well enough now to tell the difference between physical discomfort and the other kind. "Are you going to say something," she said, "about the other night?" He held her gaze. "Are you?" She pulled the second chair from the corner and sat down across from him, and she decided in the moment of sitting that she was done with the careful management of what she said and didn't say around this man. "I stayed because you needed someone to stay," she said. "And I'm not going to pretend that's the whole of it, because it isn't, and you know it isn't. But I'm also not going to build something out of one hard night that you didn't ask for and couldn't control." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair way to put it." "I'm a fair person," she said. "You are," he said. It came out simply, without the slight defensive edge she'd expected. Just a direct acknowledgement, the way he acknowledged things that were true and didn't require dressing up. He shifted his leg on the stool and winced briefly, and she watched him manage the wince back to neutral with the practiced control of someone who'd been managing pain in front of people for a long time. "Mara," he said. "Yes." "I haven't—" He stopped. He looked at the window, then back at her. "I haven't been good at this, the whole of it, since the beginning." "Neither have I," she said. "You've been patient," he said. "I'm not sure I deserve that kind of patience." "I wasn't being patient with you," she said. "I was being patient with myself." "There's a difference." He considered this. "What were you waiting for? To figure out whether what I was feeling was real or whether I was just—" She stopped and said the thing she'd been thinking since November without letting herself say it. "I've spent a long time believing that what I wanted didn't count for much, that I was here to be useful and capable and reliable, and that was the trade. And I didn't want to mistake kindness for something else and make a fool of myself." The room was quiet. "You haven't made a fool of yourself," he said. "Not yet," she said. That almost smile crossed his face, the one she'd first seen in November, the shadow of it, the suggestion. "Not yet," he agreed. She looked at him. He looked at her. And something that had been held carefully apart for a very long time simply stopped being held apart. Not explosively, not with any gesture. Just the way water finds level when you stop holding it back. Quietly, completely, and without any pretense of surprise. He healed slowly, which he hated, and impatiently, which she expected, and with Cole's help and 2 visits from the doctor, and more of Mara's cooking than she was willing to add up. She came 3 times that first week. She told herself the first visit was practical. The second visit was because she'd promised Cole she'd bring more flour, and it made sense to deliver it directly. By the third visit, she'd stopped accounting for it and simply came, and Gideon had stopped pretending not to be watching the road when she pulled up. They talked differently now. Not because the careful management was entirely gone, some of it would probably never entirely go, built into both of them too deep to fully surface, but because the night of the fever had stripped something away that neither of them had known how to remove voluntarily. You can't be that honest with someone in the dark and then return to the performance of distance. It costs too much to maintain. He told her things. Not all at once, not in the outpouring way of a man who had been waiting for an audience, but in the gradual way of someone who had kept his own company long enough that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have his thoughts reach another person and be received. He told her about Eleanor, not the grief of losing her, but the texture of who she'd been, which was a different and harder thing to share. He told her about the first winter after, when he'd worked himself nearly to illness because the alternative was being inside the house with her absence, and he hadn't been able to manage that yet. He told her about Cole, who'd come to work for him at 16, 2 years after Eleanor died, and who'd become something closer to a younger brother than an employee without Gideon ever making a decision for it to happen that way. She told him things too. About Thomas's last year. The slow and terrible quality of a man you love becoming someone you can only watch diminish. About the peculiar guilt of surviving someone. The irrational sense that continuing to live and plant apple trees and bake pies and exist in your own body was somehow a betrayal of the person who no longer could. About the way she'd rebuilt herself after, deliberately, practically, brick by brick, and how effective that reconstruction had been, and how it had also produced a woman who'd forgotten how to want things that weren't useful. "You know what the worst thing is," she said, on a Wednesday afternoon in late June, sitting on his porch because the front room was too warm and he'd been getting cabin fever from the chair by the window. "It's not the missing them. The missing is manageable. It's the way you rebuild yourself around the missing, so carefully that by the time you're stable again, you've become someone who fits the shape of a loss instead of the shape of a life. He was quiet for a long time. Yes, he said. That's it exactly. She looked at the yard. He looked at the yard. The summer heat pressed down on everything, and the grass in the distance shimmered, and the roan mare, back in her paddock, no harm from her days away, stood motionless in the shade of the barn. What was it you said, he asked, about Thomas's boots? That I needed the back door back. Yes. He turned to look at her. Eleanor's scarf. I moved it. She looked at him. Last week, he said, while I was off my feet and had nothing to do but sit with things. He held her gaze. I put it in the chest at the foot of the bed, with her other things. She didn't say anything immediately. She sat with what he'd said and the weight of it and the specific courage it represented in a man who had walked past that scarf every morning for 6 years. How did it feel, she said. Like something that needed doing, he said, and like something I couldn't have done earlier. She nodded. Both things can be true, she said. Both things were true, he said. He came back to the Sunday market in July. He was not at full strength. She could see that in how he moved, the slight accommodation his body was still making for the knee. But he was upright and functional and clearly unwilling to miss another week. He came at his usual time, 7 minutes either side of 10, and he crossed the square and came to her table, and she already had his slice cut. He looked at the slice. He looked at her. Cherry, he said. Apple sold out an hour ago, she said. You're late. I'm exactly on time. For someone who doesn't have a bad knee, you walked slower. He put his quarter on the cloth. She put it in her pocket. He came around to the second stool without being asked and sat down, and the shape of it, the normalcy of it, the ease, settled into the morning like something that had always been there and had only been waiting for them to stop being afraid of it. The market crowd was the same as any summer Sunday. The farmers and the families and the traders and the people who came every week for reasons that had more to do with seeing people than buying anything. Dottie Crane was at her preserves table. The rope seller was back after his absence. The dry goods store had an awning out against the sun. And Lenora Pike was there. She was always there. She came by later when the crowd had thinned a little and Mara's table was quieter. She didn't stop at the table. She passed it, in the deliberate way of a woman who wants to be seen not stopping. But her eyes went to Gideon on his stool and to Mara behind the table, and her expression did something that was not quite readable from a distance, except that it was not nothing. Gideon noticed. He said nothing. Mara noticed. She said nothing. But when Lenora had passed, he said quietly, without turning his head, She's waiting for something to be wrong. She'll wait a long time, Mara said. I know, he said. What? July became August. August was when things moved. She thought, afterward, that it was the conversation about the bakery that changed the direction of everything. Not because she hadn't thought about it before, but because she'd thought about it the way you think about things you've decided aren't possible, with a kind of fondness, the way you might look at a photograph of a place you know you'll never visit. The idea had been company, not a plan. It started with something he said offhandedly on a Saturday afternoon at her table when she'd just finished packing the remaining stock and her hands were covered in flour and she was making the mental arithmetic of the week's take against the week's costs. You're going to run out of space, he said. He was looking at the racks above the work table where 3 pies were cooling and she'd run out of safe places to set the 4th. I always run out of space, she said. I've been running this kitchen past capacity for 2 years. What would you do if you had more? She looked at him. Space, he said. What would you do? She looked at the cooling pies. She looked at her kitchen. She thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about things when someone asked them as if they expected a real answer. I'd bake every day, she said. Not just for Sunday. I'd have a proper counter, at a proper height, not the one Thomas built that's 4 inches too low for me. She stopped. There's an empty storefront on Garrison's Main Street, corner of First and Mill. Been empty since the hardware man left in the spring. I've seen it, he said. It's the right size, she said, for what I'd need, good light from the east windows. She said it without thinking, and then she heard herself say it and pulled back the way she'd learned to pull back from things she wanted, Because wanting something you couldn't have was a waste of energy, and she'd never been able to afford waste. You could do that, he said. I don't have the capital, she said. I have the homestead loan and the equipment loan and a pig that's due to be sold and the Sunday market take. That's what I have. He was quiet for a moment. I could... Don't, she said. He stopped. I know what you're going to say, she said, and I'm not going to take money from you. That's not a thing I'm willing to do. It wouldn't be... I know what it would be, and I know what it would feel like, and I'm telling you no. She said it without heat, but firmly, the way she said things she'd decided. I appreciate you wanting to help. I'm telling you that help in that specific form is something I can't accept without it becoming something else. He held her gaze. He wasn't defensive. That was one of the things about him she'd come to trust, that he didn't defend himself against being told no. He just sat with it. All right, he said. Thank you, she said. They were quiet for a moment. Then she said with the part of her mind that never stopped running numbers, what would a proper loan look like? A real one, with terms. He looked at her. Not a gift, she said. A loan. Written down, signed, with a repayment schedule and interest. The way a bank would do it, except a bank wouldn't loan to a woman with a homestead mortgage already against her name. He was very still, thinking. I'd need to know the number, he said, for the storefront lease and the equipment. I'd need to work it out properly, she said, but I've had the numbers in my head for 2 years. I know roughly what it looks like. Write it down, he said. All of it. What you need, what you'd expect to bring in, how long the repayment would take. Write it the way you'd write it for a bank. She stared at him. You're serious? You want a loan or a conversation about a loan? A beat. Give me a week, she said. She gave herself 5 days. She sat at her kitchen table on Sunday night after market, and she did what she'd been doing in her head for 2 years out loud on paper. The cost of the storefront lease per month, the cost of the additional equipment she'd need, the cost of the supplies to expand from Sunday only to 5 days a week, the projected income based on what she knew the market could bear in Garrison, the repayment timeline at 3 different interest rates. She'd never formally learned accounting. Thomas had kept his own book simply, and she'd kept hers the same way. But she understood numbers the way she understood most things, practically, precisely, without sentimentality. She worked it 4 different ways. She was conservative in her projections because she didn't trust optimism in numbers. She built in a margin for a bad quarter. She did not build in anything that assumed help from anyone except herself and the 2 women she'd thought about asking to work half days, if it came to that. On Friday, she drove out to the Rourke spread with the papers in an envelope. He read them at his kitchen table while she sat across from him, and he took his time with it, which she appreciated. He didn't skim. He went through each section carefully, and twice he asked questions about the equipment costs, about the lease terms she'd estimated. And she answered them from what she'd confirmed with the landlord's agent, whom she'd visited on Tuesday without telling Gideon she was doing it. He set the papers down. The interest rate you've written here, he said. 5%, she said. That's what the Billings Bank charges on commercial loans. That's what they charge men, he said, without a pre-existing mortgage against their property. She held his gaze. 5% is what I'm offering. He looked at her for a long moment. 4, he said. 5, she said. Mara, Gideon. She leaned forward slightly. If this isn't a real loan, it's something else. And I can't take something else from you. You know why. He was quiet. He looked at the papers. He looked at her. 5%, he said. 12-month repayment schedule with a 6-month review. Agreed, she said. He got up, still with the slight accommodation for the knee, though less now. And he went to his desk in the corner of the room, and he pulled out a blank paper and he wrote the terms out in full, both of their names, the amount, the interest, the schedule, the date. He signed it. He brought it to the table. She read every word. She signed it. He kept 1 copy. She took the other. She folded it into the envelope and put it in her coat pocket and sat for a moment with both hands flat on the table. I need to say something, she said. All right, he said. She looked at him. This doesn't change what I owe you. The loan is the loan. Whatever else is between us is separate from it, and I won't let it become confused. If the bakery fails, I'll repay the loan. If things between us... She stopped, found the words. If things between us change, the loan is still the loan. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, the one he had when she said something true that he hadn't expected her to say out loud. "I know that," he said. "I wanted to say it clearly." "You're right to say it clearly," he said. A pause. "Mara," he said. "Yes. I love you." He said it the way he said everything that mattered, plainly, without setup, without the trappings of sentiment, just the fact of it, laid on the table between them like the signed paper. "Not because you saved my life, not because you bake pie or fix fences or know how to bring a fever down. Because you are you, specifically, and I don't know how to be clearer than that." She sat very still. She'd known it was coming. She'd known it for months in the way you know things you haven't let yourself say. She'd known it from the road and the coffee and the washed cloth, and the way he stood beside her stool at the market, like a man who'd found the place he was supposed to be. She'd known it. But knowing it was coming and hearing it said were different. The way knowing a storm is coming is different from standing in the first rain. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I've been stubborn about admitting it." "I know," he said. "You knew?" "I suspected," he said. "The day you brought the crate. You'd told yourself it was practical." She looked at him. "You could see that?" "Mara," he said, with the patience of a man who has watched someone be very capable at everything except allowing herself to be known. "I've been watching you since November." She sat with this. She thought about how thoroughly she'd believed she was managing her own face. She thought about the 7-minute window and the way he'd taken to standing in the spot where he could see her table before crossing the square. And she thought about a man who'd noticed she looked tired on a cold January morning and said so directly when most people wouldn't have said anything. "You could have said something earlier," she said. "So could you," he said. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She picked up her coffee cup and took a drink and set it back down. "Fair point," she said. "Bob." It was 2 weeks later that he made his mistake, and she was grateful for it, in the way you're grateful for things that are painful but necessary, that clarify without destroying. They were at her homestead. He'd come on a Saturday, as he'd been coming most Saturdays, and they'd been talking about the storefront. She'd begun negotiating the lease in earnest, and the first meeting with the landlord's agent had gone reasonably well, meaning they hadn't laughed at her, which was the bar she'd set. She was describing the counter she wanted to have built, the specific height, the reason for it, and he'd been listening with the focused attention he gave things that interested him. And then he'd said with complete sincerity and no awareness of what he was saying, "It'll be good. When the bakery's running, the house will need that." She stopped. She looked at him. "What house?" she said. He looked back at her, and she could see the exact moment he heard what he'd just said. "I meant, which house," she said, "needs the bakery?" His jaw tightened slightly. He knew. She could see that he knew. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded," he said. "How did you mean it?" She was not angry. Not yet, not exactly. But something had gone very still in her. Because the way it sounded was, "The bakery is something that will be useful to a household, your household, and I am the person who will be in it." "Mara, I'm not a feature, Gideon." She said it quietly. "I'm not something that makes your house better. I'm not a solution to a problem your house has." He was quiet. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who understood he'd done something wrong and was working out whether to defend it or sit with it. He sat with it. She gave him credit for that. "You're right," he said. "I know I'm right," she said. "The question is whether you actually understand why." He was quiet for a moment longer. "I was thinking, genuinely, not performing thought." She waited. "Because what I said put you in the house before you'd agreed to be in the house," he said. "And because it made the bakery about the house instead of about you." She looked at him. "And because," he said more slowly, "I've been thinking about the future in a way I didn't bother telling you about, and that's—" He stopped. "That's not fair to you." She picked up her cup. She looked out the kitchen window at her apple trees in the August afternoon. "I'm not asking you not to think about the future," she said. "I'm asking you to understand that I'm not a piece of it you've already placed. I'm a person deciding." She paused. "I'm still deciding, and I need that to be real." "It's real," he said. "Then I need you to act like it's real," she said, "not like it's already done." He nodded, slowly. The particular nod of a man absorbing a correction he knows is correct. She got up. She refilled his coffee without asking. She refilled her own. She sat back down. The silence between them was not the silence of a fight. It was the silence of two people who had just said something difficult and arrived somewhere slightly more honest than they'd been before. "I'm going to walk out to the orchard," she said. "Come if you want." He came. They walked through the apple trees in the late afternoon, not speaking, not needing to. And she showed him the 9 trees she'd planted, the ones along the south fence with the better drainage, and he looked at them with the expression he had for things that had been done right. "You were right about the drainage," he said. "I usually am," she said. He almost smiled. "I know," he said. "I'm getting used to it." He came to the market the following Sunday, as he always did. But he came differently. He didn't go to the stool. He stood at the table while she finished with a customer, and when the woman had moved on, he put both hands on the cloth and leaned slightly forward, and he said, "I want you at the market on Sunday because Sunday is better with you in it. I want you at my table on Saturday because the house is quieter when you're not there, and I have stopped being glad about that quietness. I want to help you build the bakery because you should have it, and because watching you build something is—" He stopped. "It's something I don't want to miss." He held her gaze. "I don't need a housekeeper, Mara. I don't need a cook. I need the specific person I've been coming to this table to see since November, and I've been bad at saying that plainly." She stood on her side of the cloth with her hands in her apron pocket. She thought about November, the shadow of a man she hadn't looked at directly the first time, the quarter on the cloth, good crust, the repaired road, the coffee on the fence post, the second stool, the chair beside the fever bed in the dark. She thought about what it cost a man like Gideon Rourke to stand at a market table on a Sunday morning and say a thing like that in a voice anyone nearby could hear. "You're getting better at saying things plainly," she said. "I'm trying," he said. She reached into her apron and put his quarter on the cloth herself. "Your pie is ready," she said. "Sit down." He came around to the stool and sat down, and she handed him the slice and went back to her work, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was how they'd always done it, which was how they did everything that mattered. Across the square, Lenora Pike was watching. Mara knew. She didn't look. She cut the next slice for the woman with the 2 small children who came every week and always asked for cherry. She wrapped it in paper. She made change. She smiled at the children, who were old enough to be excited about pie and young enough to show it without embarrassment. And at the edge of her vision, on his stool behind her table, in the Sunday morning light of the Garrison Market Square, Gideon Rourke sat with his pie and his coffee and his bad knee and his 6 years of carried silence and looked like a man who was exactly where he'd meant to be. She didn't need to look at him to know that. She was learning to know things without being afraid of what knowing them required her to do next. The storefront on the corner of First and Mill had been empty long enough that the windows had developed the particular opacity of neglected glass. Not dirty exactly, more like the accumulated indifference of a space that had stopped being looked at. Mara stood in front of it on a Tuesday morning in September with the signed lease in her coat pocket and the key the landlord's agent had handed her 20 minutes earlier, still warm from her grip, and she looked at it the way you look at something you've been carrying in your head for 2 years, when it finally becomes a real place you can stand in front of and touch. It was not impressive from the outside. The paint on the door frame was peeling at the upper corner. One of the east-facing window panes had a hairline crack she'd noticed on her second visit and negotiated 2 months off the first year's lease over, which the agent had agreed to with the expression of a man who had underestimated who he was dealing with. The sign above the door still read, "Hartley Hardware," in faded letters that someone had made a half-hearted attempt to paint over. She unlocked the door and went inside. The space was exactly what she'd remembered, long and narrow at the front, opening into a wider back room that had been a stock room and would now be a kitchen. The east windows, even dirty, pulled the morning light in clean and full. The floor was wood, solid under her boots, not rotted. The counter space along the north wall was the wrong height, built for a man of middling build, which meant it was too high for her by 3 inches and would have to be torn out and rebuilt. But the bones of it were good. She stood in the middle of the front room for a moment. Just stood. The smell was dust and old wood and the faint ghost of machine oil from the hardware days. It was not a smell she associated with anything. It was a blank smell, a waiting smell. She thought about her kitchen at the homestead, the dried apple rings by the window, the rack above the work table that she'd been running past capacity for 2 years, The 4-inch too-low counter that had been quietly ruining her back since Thomas built it. She thought about the Sunday market table with its hand-lettered pine plank sign and its cloth she'd been using since the first year. She thought about the woman who had set up that table because she needed to survive, and the woman standing in this empty room because she'd decided to build something. They were the same woman. That was the thing she was still learning to hold, that surviving and building weren't opposites, that you could carry both without one canceling the other. She took out the lease and read it again, standing in the dust and the east light, because she was a person who read things twice when they mattered. Then she put it back in her pocket and went to find a carpenter. Gideon had offered to help with the renovation. She'd said yes with conditions. He could contribute labor, and Cole could contribute labor, and in return she would feed them both for the duration of the work, which she calculated would take 3 to 4 weeks, and which she intended to run herself with the same precision she ran everything else. She hired 2 men from town in addition, Burl Satterfield, who was 63 and had built half the solid structures in Garrison, and whose opinion of her plans she'd solicited directly by showing him her sketches and saying, "Tell me what's wrong with this," which had earned her a look of mild respect and a 40-minute conversation about load-bearing walls and ventilation. The counter was rebuilt first. She stood beside Burl and told him the exact height she needed, not asking, telling, and when he raised an eyebrow, she said, "I'll be working this counter 8 hours a day. It needs to fit the person working it, not a hypothetical person." He'd built it to her specification without further comment. Gideon was useful in the way she'd known he'd be, without theater, without needing direction more than once, without the performance of helpfulness that some men put on when they were trying to be seen doing good. He showed up at 7 in the morning and worked until she told him to stop and ate what she put in front of him and didn't tell her she was doing anything wrong unless she asked, and when she asked, he told her directly, which she valued. Cole was less experienced but willing, and she gave him the tasks he could manage and watched him figure out the ones at the edge of his capability with the particular pleasure of someone who knows that being slightly in over your head is how you learn anything worth knowing. There was one afternoon the second week of October when she was up on a ladder painting the front room walls. Not white, she'd decided, but a warm, pale yellow that would hold the morning light and make the space feel inhabited from the first day. And Gideon was below her holding the base of the ladder without being asked, and she looked down at him and he was looking up at her with an expression she'd never quite seen on him before. Not the almost smile. Something fuller than that. Something that had the quality of a man looking at something he's decided to stop being afraid of. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Keep painting." She kept painting, but the expression stayed with her, filed away with the quarter, and the washed cloth, and the second stool, and all the other small moments she'd been collecting since November without meaning to, that had built up over the months into something she no longer needed to inventory because she already knew what it was. The opening was the first Saturday of November. She had not put an announcement in the county paper because she didn't trust announcements. They set expectations, and expectations were things you could fail to meet. Instead, she'd told Dottie Crane, who had told everyone within earshot within 48 hours, which was a more reliable distribution system than any newspaper and cost nothing. She was at the storefront at 4:30 in the morning. She'd been awake since 3, lying in her bed at the homestead running through the day's list the way she ran through everything, in order, by priority, with contingencies for the things most likely to go wrong. She'd gotten up at 3:45 when she admitted she wasn't going back to sleep and had driven to town in the dark, with the first load already in the wagon. By 6 o'clock, the ovens, 2 of them, proper commercial size, the single largest line item in her lone budget, were at temperature and the first pies were in, and the smell of them was beginning to move through the front room and out under the door and into the still November street. Gideon arrived at 6:15. He knocked once and came in and stopped just inside the door because the smell hit him, and something happened in his face that she caught sideways while she was flooring the second counter. "Don't say anything," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "You had a look." "I'm allowed a look." She pointed at the corner. "Coffee's in the pot. You can have a cup, but you're not eating anything until I know the count for the day." He poured his coffee and stood in the corner and stayed out of her way, which was the correct thing to do, and she hadn't had to explain it, which was one of the things she appreciated most about him. Cole arrived at 7 and she put him to work immediately. By 8, the front room was as ready as it was going to be. Counter clean, Display cases holding the first pies she was confident enough in to put front-facing, the sign above the door repainted in her own hand. Bellamy Bakery, the letters even and clear and dark enough to read from across the street. She unlocked the door at 8 o'clock. She stood behind her counter, exactly the right height, exactly the height she'd needed, built specifically for the woman who would work it. And she waited. The first customer was Harriet Sims, who had bought cherry pie at the Sunday market for 2 years and who appeared at 8:03 with her daughter and her daughter's 2 children, and who stood in the doorway for a moment looking around the room with the expression of someone arriving somewhere they'd been anticipating. "Mara Bellamy," Harriet said. "Harriet," Mara said, "cherries in the left case." By 9 o'clock there were 12 people in the shop. By 10 the first pies she'd put out were gone, and she was into the second batch, and Cole was running between the kitchen and the front room with the slightly overwhelmed look of someone who has just discovered the difference between imagining a thing and doing it. By noon, she'd sold more than she'd projected for a full opening day. She allowed herself, in a quiet moment between customers when the room was briefly empty, to stand behind her counter and look at the space. The yellow walls, the east light, the cases, the sign outside visible through the window, and feel what she felt, which was not triumph exactly, and not relief exactly, but something that didn't have a clean name, something that sat in the chest like a bell that has just been struck and is still ringing. She'd built this. Not for anyone else. Not because anyone needed her to. Because she'd decided to, and because she'd been capable of it, and because capability without purpose is just capacity, and she'd had capacity that had been running to waste for 4 years. She thought about Thomas, briefly and without the usual weight, not as a lost future, but as a person who had known her and would have recognized this room as something she'd always been moving toward without knowing it. She thought he would have laughed about the counter height. She thought he would have bought 2 slices on the first day. She thought about the woman she'd been at 24, standing at a gate with boots she was keeping for no reason except that she hadn't been ready yet. She was ready now. For all of it. She had been ready for longer than she'd admitted. Lenora Pike came in at 2:30. Mara saw her through the window first, the deliberate walk, the good coat, the parasol. She carried even in November because Lenora Pike was a woman of sustained presentation. She watched Lenora stop outside the window and look in, and she watched Lenora make the decision to enter, which took approximately 15 seconds, and which Mara observed with the neutral attention she gave most things. The bell above the door sounded. Lenora came to the counter. She looked at the cases. She looked at the room. She looked at Mara behind the counter. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Lenora said, "Apple, if you have it." "I have it," Mara said. She cut the slice. She wrapped it. She put it on the counter and named the price. Lenora put the coins down and picked up the slice and stood for a moment as if she were going to say something and then didn't, and turned toward the door. She stopped at the door. She turned back. "It's a nice space," she said. Flatly, without warmth but without poison either. Just an observation. "Thank you," Mara said. Lenora left. Mara stood behind her counter and looked at the door after it had closed, and thought about how much time and energy she had spent, over the past year, anticipating the thing Lenora represented. The judgment, the dismissal, the voice that said, "You are not what men come looking for. You are not what the world chooses. You are useful, but not wanted." She'd spent so much time braced against it. And now Lenora Pike had walked into her bakery and bought a slice of apple pie and called the space nice, and Mara found that she didn't need anything more from that than what it was. Not an apology. Not a reversal. Not a public acknowledgement that she'd been wrong. She didn't need Lenora to be sorry. She had her counter at exactly the right height and 2 commercial ovens and a loan. She was going to pay back ahead of schedule, and a man who had come to her table every Sunday since November because life was better when she was in it. She was good. The loan was paid in full 9 months after the opening. She drove out to the Rourke spread on a Thursday morning in August, 1 year and 2 months after the fever, 1 year exactly after she'd sat at her kitchen table and written out the projections on plain paper and told herself she was being conservative. And she put the payment envelope on his kitchen table with the signed receipt she'd drawn up herself. He looked at the envelope. "That's 3 months early," he said. "I know," she said. "Strong spring. 2 orders for the hotel in Billings, and the school started buying from me in March." He picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. She'd already settled the arithmetic with him. She'd been keeping him current on the numbers the way she'd promised when they signed the papers. And he sat with it for a moment. "You don't have to do this now," he said. "The terms gave you another quarter." "I know what the terms said," she said. "I'm choosing to finish it now." He looked at her across the table. "Because?" he said. She met his eyes. "Because I need the loan to be done before anything else changes between us. I need it to be clean." Something settled in his face. He understood what she was saying, that she'd been holding a line, carefully, between the loan and the rest of it, because the loan had to be a loan and nothing more. And now it was done, and now the line no longer needed holding. "All right," he said. He put the envelope in his desk drawer. He came back to the table. He sat down. "Mara," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. Her hands were still on the table, flat. She didn't move them. "I'm not going to ask you to come to my house," he said. "I'm not going to ask you to run my kitchen or manage my ranch or be anything that makes my life easier to run. I know you know that. But I want to say it clearly anyway, because you told me once to act like things are real, and this is real, so I'm saying it." He held her gaze. "I want to marry you. Not because of what you do, because of who you are. Because I have sat across from you at tables for close to 2 years, and I don't want to sit across from you anymore. I want to sit beside you, for whatever's left." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the summer was at its fullest. The grass high, the roan mare in the paddock, the distant fence line that had nearly taken him from her shimmering in the August heat. She thought about November, the quarter on the cloth, the second stool, the thin January morning when he'd said you looked tired and she'd said, "I am," and neither of them had known yet what they were beginning. She thought about the fever night and the gray morning after, and his fingers against hers on the blanket. She thought about the counter at exactly the right height, her name on the sign, the loan, paid in full, the receipt in his desk drawer, the clean line between what he'd given her and what she'd built herself. She thought about what it had cost her to arrive here, not in money, not in labor, but in the harder currency of letting herself believe she was worth arriving. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen of a house she'd been coming to for over a year, with the summer outside and the coffee cooling between them, and neither of them said anything because nothing else was required. They married that October. Not a large wedding. Neither of them had the patience for large, and between them they had an instinctive distrust of events that required more performance than the actual occasion warranted. It was done at the county office on a Tuesday, with Cole as witness and Dottie Crane as the second, because Dottie had somehow found out and arrived with flowers she'd grown herself, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for something like this since March of the previous year and intended to be present for it, regardless of whether she'd technically been invited. Mara wore her good dress, not a wedding dress, just her best one, dark blue wool, the one she'd had made 3 years ago for Thomas's memorial service and had worn twice since, which she'd decided was a waste of a good dress and had resolved to wear more. She'd let her hair down, which she almost never did outside the house. Gideon looked at her when she came out of the back room at the county office, and the look he gave her was not the almost smile. It was the real thing, full and direct. A smile that she'd been adding to her collection of evidence since November of the previous year, and that still, seeing it plainly for one of the first times, did something she wouldn't have been able to describe to anyone's satisfaction. She smiled back. She didn't manage it or modulate it. She just let it be what it was. The ceremony was short and functional, and she signed her name clearly, and he signed his. And Cole shook Gideon's hand with the solemn earnestness of a young man taking the occasion seriously, and Dottie cried, which Dottie had known she was going to do and had brought a handkerchief in preparation. Afterward, they had dinner at the bakery. She'd baked, of course, because she always baked, and because the bakery was hers and it was the right place. And Cole ate 3 slices of pie, and Dottie told the story of the first time she'd told Mara about Gideon, and Mara had said he's just a customer in the tone of someone saying something they didn't entirely believe, and everyone at the table laughed, including Mara, who laughed at herself without difficulty when the thing being laughed at was true. She kept the bakery in her own name. This had not been a point of negotiation. It had simply been the fact of it, and Gideon had never suggested otherwise. Bellamy Bakery. On the sign above the door, because it was her name and her work and her loan paid off in 9 months, and her counter built to her height, and her projections that she'd done on plain paper at her kitchen table that had proven, in the end, more accurate than conservative. She kept the homestead, too, for the first year because she wasn't a person who moved quickly on large decisions, and because she wanted to be sure she was keeping what was hers for the right reasons, and not as a hedge against a future she no longer actually believed would require hedging. Eventually, she leased it to a young couple from the East who were coming into the territory with more optimism than experience, which she recognized, and she gave them the information they needed and charged them fairly, and thought that the apple trees would be in good hands because she'd told the woman, specifically, about the south fence and the drainage, and the woman had listened the way people listen when they know they're hearing something important. She moved to the Rourke spread the following spring. The hook inside the front door, where Eleanor's blue scarf had hung for 6 years, held nothing now. She didn't put anything on it. Not immediately. It was just a hook, which was what hooks were before they became something else. One evening in May, coming in from the bakery, she took off her own scarf. Deep red wool, one she'd bought in town the previous winter because she'd decided she was going to own things she liked, not just things that were practical, and she hung it on the hook. She didn't think about it until she walked past it the next morning and noticed it there, which stopped her for a moment in the hallway. She stood and looked at it, her red scarf on a hook inside the front door of a house that was becoming hers by the gradual accumulation of her own presence in it. She thought about Eleanor, whom she'd never known but whose kitchen she'd sat in, and whose house she was learning, and whose husband she'd married. She thought about that without guilt, and without the particular kind of comparative anxiety that some people might have felt, because she was not a woman given to wasting time on comparisons that were designed to make her lose. Eleanor had been real and loved and worth grieving, and those things were true. And she was real and loved and here, and those things were also true. Both truths fit in the same house without fighting. She went to the kitchen and started coffee. Gideon came in 20 minutes later from the early morning barn check, and he hung his hat on the peg beside the door, and his eyes passed over the red scarf, and then he looked at her across the kitchen. She was watching him. He looked at the scarf again. Something in his face was quiet, in the way of things that have been laid down after a long time of being carried. He came to the kitchen and poured his coffee and said nothing about it. He didn't need to, neither did she. On the first Sunday that the bakery was open for morning hours, a change she'd made in spring, adding Sunday mornings to her regular schedule because the demand was there and she'd finally hired her second full-time worker, a woman named Agnes who had 6 children and a gift for pastry and an absolute refusal to be intimidated by a commercial oven. Gideon came in at 10 minutes to 10. He sat at the table by the east window. She brought him his coffee before he asked. She brought him his slice, apple, always apple on Sunday. She'd stopped pretending there was any other option. And she set them on the table in front of him and went back behind the counter. He sat with his coffee in the Sunday morning light, and he watched her work. And she worked the way she'd always worked, directly, fully, without performance, without waste. Agnes came through from the back with 2 pies and raised an eyebrow at Gideon in the window, and Mara said, without looking up from the dough she was wrapping, "That's my husband." Agnes looked at him again. "He comes for the apple?" "Every Sunday," Mara said. "Since the beginning." "Good taste," Agnes said, and went back to the kitchen. Mara smiled at her dough. There's something she understood by the time she was 30 years old that she hadn't understood at 25 when she was setting up her market table in the cold and telling herself that usefulness was enough. It is not enough. Usefulness is not nothing. She would never say it was nothing, because she knew what it had cost her to build it and what it had carried her through. But it is not the whole of a life. It is not a substitute for being seen. She had spent too many years accepting the judgment of people who looked at her and saw the sum of her labor and called it the sum of her worth. Strong Mara. Capable Mara. Useful Mara. The woman who fixed things and fed people and managed alone and would manage alone forever because that was her nature, her size, her shape, her lot. That was someone else's story about her. She had been too tired, too busy surviving to notice that she'd been living inside it. The thing she knew now was this: you do not earn the right to be loved by demonstrating your indispensability. Love is not a transaction where you perform enough value to justify the cost of being chosen. Anyone who loves you in exchange for your usefulness does not love you. They've hired you on emotional terms and called it something warmer than it is. What she had found, what she'd been finding since November, one Sunday at a time, one quarter on a cloth at a time, was something different. Something that didn't require her to be more, to be smaller, to be other, to justify. Something that had simply said, you, specifically, are the person I come to this table to see. That kind of choosing is rare. She knew it. She had not taken it for granted on the day it arrived, and she did not take it for granted now. But she also knew something else. Something she thought about on mornings when she was in the bakery before the town was awake. When it was just her and the ovens and the early light coming through the east windows, she had not been saved by being chosen. She had been building toward herself long before Gideon Rourke crossed a market square with a quarter in his hand. The bakery was hers before he agreed to fund it. The counter was hers before she had the money to build it. The woman who knew exactly how her counter needed to be built, who had written her business projections in conservative numbers and paid off her loan 9 months early. That woman had been assembling herself in the dark of 4 years of solitude and hard work and refused self-pity. Being loved didn't make her. It found her already made, still in the process of making, which is the only honest way to arrive at anything. She would tell this to the young woman who started working for her 2 years after Agnes, who was 22 and had come from a farm 20 miles east, and who worked hard and said very little, and one afternoon, wrapping pies in the back room, said suddenly, "Mrs. Rourke, do you think—" and then stopped, embarrassed. "Do I think what?" Mara said. The young woman looked at her flour-covered hands. "Do you think it matters? What size you are? What you look like? Whether men—" She stopped again. Mara looked at her for a moment. She set down what she was holding. "You're asking whether the world will see past it," she said. The young woman nodded, still looking at her hands. "Some of it won't," Mara said. "I'm not going to lie to you about that. There will be people who look at you and calculate your worth by things that have nothing to do with your worth. You cannot fix those people and you cannot wait for them." She paused. "But that's not the question you're really asking." The young woman looked up. "You're asking whether you're allowed to want things," Mara said. "The bakery kind and the other kind. Whether someone like you is allowed to want a life that fits who you actually are." A pause. "Yes," the young woman said. "You're allowed," Mara said. "You've always been allowed. The only thing that was ever in your way was someone else's story about what you deserved." She turned back to her work. "Finish those wraps. We've got an order due at noon." The young woman finished the wraps. She didn't say anything else, but Mara could see, without looking directly, that something had changed in the set of her shoulders. Mara knew that change. She recognized it the way you recognize something you've carried yourself. The specific shift of weight when a person begins, for the first time, to put down someone else's accounting of them. Years later, the people of Garrison still told the story. The version that circulated most often was the romantic one: the lonely rancher, the market table, the pie, the slow and stubborn falling toward each other of two people who should have spoken sooner. It was a good story in that version. People liked it. Dottie Crane had told it so many times it had acquired the smoothness of a thing refined by repetition, and she told it with the proprietary warmth of someone who had been present for the original material. Lenora Pike's version, whatever it was never one she shared in public, at least not after the bakery opened. She came in regularly, twice a month, always apple, always paid full price. And if there was something in how she moved through the door that suggested a woman who had revised a position without fully admitting she'd held the original one, Mara didn't remark on it. She cut the slice. She wrapped it. She named the price. That was all that was required. Mara's own version of the story was different from the one the town told, as it usually is. In her version, the beginning was not a man crossing a market square. The beginning was a woman setting up a table in the cold because she needed to survive, and she had pies, and she had a hand-lettered sign, and she was not going to let the cold or the debt or the particular exhaustion of a person living alone inside a grief they hadn't finished with stop her from doing what needed doing. That woman was the beginning. Everything else, the quarter, the stool, the road, the fever night, the contract on plain paper, the counter at exactly the right height, everything else grew from her. She was worth choosing. She had been worth choosing all along. She had simply spent too many years standing outside her own life, waiting for someone else to open a door she'd had the key to the whole time. Now, every Sunday morning, while Agnes managed the front and the east windows, held the light and the smell of apple pie moved through the room and out into the street, Gideon sat at the table by the window with his coffee. He read sometimes. He watched the street. He watched her work. She didn't need to watch him back to know he was there. She knew the shape of him the way she knew her counter and her ovens, and the particular pull of the east-facing windows on a clear morning, not because she'd memorized it, but because it had become part of the ordinary fabric of her days, threaded through every hour without effort, the way the things that are truly yours eventually settle into you. She had not been too large, too strong, too ordinary, too self-sufficient, too damaged, too much, or too little for this life. She had only needed to stop measuring herself by the distance between who she was and who other people had decided she should have been. The apple pies sold out before 10 o'clock, as they always did. And Mara Bellamy, Mara Rourke, worked her counter in her bakery in her own name and was, without drama, without resolution, without the clean ending of stories that have been smoothed by the telling, exactly where she had always been going.